Welcome in session 1 on eating protein in an environmentally friendly way. In this session, we will start with a presentation that has been pre-recorded as the presenter cannot be here today. But afterwards, we will answer questions and answers, and you can ask the questions in the question and answers box. And to answer these questions, I'm here with 2 other people at the table. In front of me is Margreet Oldhoff. She is a colleague from the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, health sciences, a nutritionist. And the other person at the table is Marcelo Tiesler. And Marcelo is our environmental specialist. He is from Blonk Consultants, and he knows a lot about the Optimeal program that has been used in our research and that Alessandra will tell you more about. And my name is Ingeborg Brouwer. I'm also from the Vrije Universiteit, from the Health Sciences Department, and I've been involved in the PROMISE project from the very early start. And my other colleagues were also involved in the PROMISE project, of course. And I'm really proud and happy to present Alessandra Grasso. And she's a PhD candidate at our university. And she will finish her PhD later this year on effects of the diet on environment and health. And today she will give the presentation. So, Alessandra, the floor is yours.
Hello, I'm Alessandra Grasso, and as a PhD candidate at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, I am exploring the pivotal role of dietary protein in the link between healthy aging and the environmental impact of diets. In this presentation, I will share with you our core findings within the PROMISE project on eating protein in an environmentally sustainable way. Findings from the PROMISE project highlight the importance of sufficient protein intake for healthy aging, and it supports previous research indicating the benefits of raising current protein recommendations from 0.8 to at least 1 gram of protein per kilogram body weight per day for promoting physical function in older adults aged 65 years and older. When talking about protein and food in general, we need to not only think about nutrition and health outcomes, but also environmental outcomes. From farm to fork to waste, each step in the food's life cycle has an impact on the natural environment. Adding it all up, our current food system contributes to about 1/3 of total greenhouse gas emissions, contributing greatly to climate change. And it's a primary driver of biodiversity loss on land and in water, deforestation, and soil and water pollution around the world. Agriculture alone uses 70% of fresh water available and takes up 50% of the planet's habitable surface. And agriculture and livestock together are by far the greatest contributors of all these impacts. But when looking at the consumption level, it's the amount of food that we eat and the food choices that we make that have a direct impact on our environmental footprint. And that is because different food products have different impacts on the environment. Here, you could see greenhouse gas emissions per gram of protein of different protein sources, with protein derived from animal products having on average a greater impact compared to protein derived from plant sources. While that might be well known, what is less well known is that among the different animal protein sources, there are differences in impacts, with beef and lamb having a higher impact compared to pork and chicken. It is also important to highlight that there is significant variability in these impacts, depending on numerous environmental factors such as country of origin, farming practices, and transportation use. Despite this variability, an overwhelming number of studies have shown that meat has the largest impact in European diets. In Europe, on average, 60% of total protein consumed is derived from animal sources, while only 40% is derived from plant-based sources. Therefore, advising older adults to consume more protein based on food consumption patterns is likely to favor animal protein and in turn increase the environmental impact of the diet, especially if environmental sustainability is not considered. But then you may ask, how can older adults increase protein intake in an environmentally sustainable way? To answer this question, we conducted a modeling study using Optimeal, which is a software developed by Blanc consultants for the optimization of diets. We combined food consumption data from older adults participating in the Longitudinal Aging Study Amsterdam, or LASA, with nutritional and environmental properties, and we set environmental and dietary constraints. To illustrate what we mean by setting constraints, we wanted to model high-protein diets, and therefore we put a lower boundary on protein intake to 1.2 grams per kilogram body weight per day, so that the model diets would deliver at least this amount of protein. We fed all of this data into the software and conducted quadratic programming to model several high-protein diets. Diet optimization is a powerful tool to model realistic diets because the optimization searches for the most similar diet to the habitual diet. The habitual protein intake of older adults participating in the LASA study was 1 gram of protein per kilogram body weight per day. And we wanted to see what changes needed to be made to the diet to increase the protein intake to 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day without taking environmental sustainability into account. In this high-protein diet, we found that the quantities of all types of meat, fish, and cheese increased, as well as nuts and meat and dairy alternatives, while fats, oils, and sweets decreased to maintain the same energy content. Such changes led to a 13% increase in greenhouse gas emissions of the diet. We then wanted to see what would happen if we constrained these changes so that they would adhere to the Dutch food-based dietary guidelines for a healthy diet. We found that the total meat content of the diet needed to be reduced to meet the recommended limit of 500 grams of meat per week, which resulted in a reduction in beef, lamb, pork, and processed meat. We also saw that the quantity of fish decreased to 1 serving per week, as that is what is recommended in the dietary guidelines. Further, we saw an increase in vegetables and even a stronger increase in nuts and meat and dairy alternatives compared to the previous diet. And these changes led to a 7% increase in greenhouse gas emissions of the diet compared to the habitual diet. Then, in addition to these constraints, we added an upper limit on greenhouse gas emissions to see what changes to the diet are needed for a 50% greenhouse gas emission reduction. We found that the total meat content remained at the recommended limit of 500 grams per week, but a change in meat type was made. Beef and lamb were removed from the diet, and pork and processed meat were reduced, while poultry increased to fully replace beef and lamb and to partially replace pork and processed meat. In addition, there were much larger increases in the quantities of diverse plant-based products, such as whole grains, nuts, legumes, and meat and dairy alternatives, compared to the previous diets. So this study showed that a greenhouse gas emission reduction is possible with meat and other animal-based protein sources remaining in the diet, but that a change in meat type is needed, along with increased consumption of diverse plant-based protein sources to keep the diet within sound environmental limits. This study demonstrates that it is possible to achieve a high-protein diet with lower greenhouse gas emissions, but that environmental sustainability needs to be taken into account. If it's not taken into account, it will lead to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions of the diet. But that was a modeling study. What if older adults are told to increase their protein intake? What changes would they make to their current diet? And what effect would that have on the environmental impact of their diet? Well, thanks to the PROMISE randomized controlled trial, we were able to examine the effect of dietary advice aiming at increasing protein intake on the environmental impact of the diet in community-dwelling older adults in real life. So older adults with low protein intake from Finland and the Netherlands were randomized into 3 groups. 2 groups that received dietary advice aiming at increasing protein intake, and 1 control group, which didn't receive any dietary counseling. For the purposes of this study, we only included participants from the Netherlands, as we have Dutch environmental data, and we combined the 2 intervention groups together into 1 group of participants who received dietary advice, and we named this the Protein Plus group. So trained nutritionists provided participants within the Protein Plus group with personalized dietary advice to isocalorically increase their protein intake to at least 1.2 grams per kilogram body weight per day based on dietary preferences, protein intake, and body weight at baseline. Advice included the use of habitually consumed food items, such as meat and dairy, as well as protein-enriched food items that were not habitually eaten, but were given to them during the trial, like protein powder. But the advice did not take environmental sustainability into account. Dietary intake was measured with 3 24-hour recalls at baseline and at 6 months, and was linked to Dutch environmental data to calculate the environmental impact of the diets at the 2 different time points. We assessed the 6-month change in food consumption and in diet greenhouse gas emissions, and compared the change between the Protein Plus group and the control group using mixed model analyses. Here you could see the total protein intake in grams per day in the control group and the Protein Plus group at baseline and at the 6-month follow-up. While both groups had similar protein intake at baseline, older adults who received dietary advice to increase protein intake had a higher protein intake at the 6-month follow-up. When comparing the 6-month changes between the 2 groups, the Protein Plus group increased their protein intake by 47%, or 29 grams of protein, with a 95% confidence interval between 24 to 34 grams of protein. We took a deeper look into the contribution of the different foods to total protein intake in grams of protein per day. When comparing the 6-month changes in intake between the Protein Plus group and the control group, the Protein Plus group slightly increased consumption of protein derived from plant-based sources, although you could see that the 95% confidence interval is close to 0. But they largely increased consumption of protein derived from animal sources and from protein-enriched food products that were given to them in the trial. But what effect did this have on the environmental impact of the diet? Well, here you could see the total greenhouse gas emissions of the diet in the control group and the Protein Plus group at baseline and at 6-month follow-up. When comparing the 6-month changes in the greenhouse gas emissions of the diet between these 2 groups, we found that the greenhouse gas emissions of the Protein Plus group increased by 16%, with a 95% confidence interval of 7 to 24%. And what we found is that dietary advice led to a 33% increase in greenhouse gas emissions coming from animal-based foods, and no change in greenhouse gas emissions from plant-based foods, miscellaneous foods, and beverages. Also, the protein-enriched foods contributed to a higher greenhouse gas emissions in the Protein Plus group at the 6-month follow-up. But while the protein-enriched foods contributed to 20% of total protein intake, it only contributed to 5% of total greenhouse gas emissions. So in this study, we confirm our hypothesis that advising older adults to increase protein intake based on current food consumption patterns favors animal protein and leads to an increase in the environmental impact of the diet. So what are the take-home messages? Well, our findings from the modeling study and the trial both show that increasing protein intake based on current food consumption patterns is likely to increase the environmental impact of the diet. Our studies support previous research demonstrating that the source of protein plays such an important role in determining the environmental impact of the diet. We found that eating meat and animal-based foods can still be a part of an environmentally friendly diet. But a net increase in protein intake should derive from plant-based sources such as nuts, legumes, and whole grains to increase the contribution of plant protein to total protein intake. If eating meat, choose poultry over beef and lamb. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Alessandra, for this very clear presentation. Now it's time for questions and answers again. And if you wonder how can I ask a question, then you go to the little gear wheel in the upper right of your screen, and you press that, you get a black box, and in this black box you can put your questions. These questions go to Margreet, and Margreet will moderate this session, and we will try to answer these questions. Thank you. Margreet, do you have anything for us?
Not yet. So I kindly invite all the people who are listening to put their question in the Q&A. And but maybe the first question, because Alessandra told us about meat and things like that. But is it not better just to skip meat?
Is it not better to skip meat? Of course, that would be an option, but it's not necessary. It is possible to eat more environmentally friendly without skipping meat completely. I think that Marcelo can say something about that as well. What would be the options for not skipping meat but making the diet more environmentally friendly?
Yes, that's a good point. Indeed, there are many studies that we do with Optimeal, for example, that really try to optimize the diet to stay within the nutritional advice and the environmental constraints. So there are actually many options. So the short answer here is that there's no one single solution. As Alessandra pointed out, even within animal foods, you have choices, right? Beef is more environmentally impactful than chicken. And you can also consider the plant-based diets. In the end, a mix of these products is actually the best solution. Where you try to choose different sources, where you also have the completeness of the proteins, as Marilyn was saying on the first session. You have different types of amino acids that you can get from the different sources. So of course you do have an option to go without meat, but if you do go without meat, you also need to be very careful in how your diet is complete. Otherwise, you're going to have nutritional deficiencies. So if you do want to reduce environmental impact, you can still keep animal products. You just need to reduce them and choose within the animal products better choices.
Yeah, if we look at the whole population, then we should eat less meat, but it doesn't mean that we should avoid meat completely. But it is a matter of making the right choices, and going from beef and lamb more towards pork and chicken is an environmentally better way to eat.
Yeah. That's also count when you want to increase protein, not just maybe replacement, but to increase protein. Would that also be the best option, to eat more of a certain meat product, or what can you do?
Yeah, what we see is that if older people want to increase protein, which is important, of course, because we see that it's a bit on the low side, that they often find it easier to keep on eating animal products. And what this study shows is that is possible, but that then you should shift from the beef and the lamb towards the chicken and eat more those products than the lamb and the beef.
Yeah, and if I may add, there are even also purely nutritional benefits, right? Because beef, for example, is also correlated with all the saturated fat that's not necessarily good for you. So if you shift to a little bit more lean source of proteins that has both nutritional and environmental benefits for your diet.
Win-win.
So it's a win-win indeed for health and the environment. Yeah. Okay, I see, just looking at questions coming in. I see a question in the study that Alessandra showed, that environmental impact was looked at the greenhouse gas emissions outcome, but the environment is more than that. Can you tell a bit about maybe other outcomes, or how do you take that into account when you advise people on the environmental impact of proteins?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Environmental impact is broad. There's many more indicators. Normally, people really tend to pay attention to one single indicator, which is climate change or carbon footprint, which was the focus of the presentation from Alessandra. But you also can look at fossil use energy and land occupation. So all these things play a role. And you have even more, like, for example, water depletion, and you have other environmental impacts that have more to do with elements that you send back to the soil. So you can look very broadly. And one thing is that when you talk about animal sources, most of the changes are going the same direction. So if you improve one, you're likely to improve in the other. When you go to plant-based, then you really need to take a look. Because, for example, if you look at soy, you might reduce the climate change, but you might actually increase the land use if you're sourcing from soy that comes from countries where there's deforestation take place. So indeed, you can look at a more broader spectrum, and that's one of the advantages that you can do with a program like Optimil, where you can put boundaries in different environmental indicators that really complete the whole picture.
Okay, and how can consumers know that? Do you have any advice on that?
That's a good question. You need to you really need to be able to have access to some of this information. We do know that certain labels, like for example the marine labels that you can look for sustainable fishing, they take into account a multitude of environmental impacts. So there are certain efforts to look at that, but that's indeed a good point that could be improved in the communication towards consumers.
Yeah, but I think it's also very important that the study that Alessandra shows gives you very good indications in what direction you should go. So we should go generally more towards plant-based instead of animal-based. And also, if you look at the different meat sources, then you should make the choices that we mentioned before.
Yeah. And nowadays, you also have the coming up of, for example, the Eco Score. So you have in many products you have the Nutri Score, which shows how good nutritionally it is, but also there's a development of the Eco Score that, for example, really try to simplify this combined information to the consumer.
Okay. Maybe something else, because we're talking about meat and plant-based protein, but what about meat and dairy, maybe alternatives? Can you tell a bit about that?
Yeah.
Is that a good alternative?
Yeah, absolutely. There are definitely a good alternatives. A good thing is that many of these products, they really try to mimic the nutritional composition of animal-based products. So if you take a dairy replacement, they will, especially when they are fortified, they really mimic, and then they are really good alternatives. If they are not, you really have to look at that to see they are. The tricky thing is that not necessarily meat replacer is environmentally friendlier than animal-based, because some meat replacers, they require a lot of additional processing exactly to simulate the structure of animal-based. So that you should also carefully and consciously look at what's actually the environmental impact of these alternatives to make sure that you are actually making the choice that you think you are making.
And also, if you look at the health aspect, I think it's important to realize that often, for example, they contain less calories and less saturated fat, which is positive, of course, but often they contain more salt, and that's something that we are not happy about, of course.
Yeah.
So that is also something to take into account.
Okay.
And often there are enough possibilities, of course, in the diet and in the main meal to have the main meal without replacements, in the sense that you take different choices without the meat or the dairy replacers.
Okay. I have a question in the chat. I hope one of you can answer it. Hemp seeds are said to be rich in protein. Is that true? Someone's asking. And if so, could there be a solution for a person who prefers a plant-based diet? Maybe you can talk a bit about the plant-based diet also. Explain a bit more about that. But hemp seeds are said to be rich of protein.
I'm not you are the more nutritional expert than me. What I do know is that they are indeed protein-based in the sense that if you look at the nutritional composition, they primarily bring protein into your body. What I do not know is how much you need to eat to reach the recommendation. So that's one thing that you need to look at, because can become irrealistic. All these alternatives, they are obviously sources of protein. But what you need, what's really important, that you always need to look at the totality of your diet. So it's not about one specific replacement, but it's about what you have in total. So if you're replacing one thing by the other, you need to make sure you still have enough calories, you still have enough carbohydrates, you still have enough fiber. So that's why, for example, if you want to look at less processed alternatives, legumes are usually a very good choice, because they naturally have a good package of nutrients and do not require as processing, and they do not have the environmental impact of an animal-based product.
Yeah. So it's also about variety, and maybe hemp seeds could contribute.
Could be
but
a
not
part
the
of
only-
the mix, but
not the only.
definitely I would not do 100% of any single product.
Yeah. Okay, clear. Thank you. Then a question, we did not talk about a lot about fish, but
Yeah,
can
that's
someone
a
you
nice one, of
about
course.
that one, because that's a tricky one, isn't it?
Yeah, fish is a tricky one. If you would look at fish in the models that we used, and then we look at the outcomes like CO2 emission, land use, etc., then fish is doing well, because not a lot of land use for fish, of course, and also for CO2 emission, it's doing quite well. So then it looks as a very attractive alternative. But we all know, of course, there are also big problems with fish. The amount of fish in our oceans is really diminishing. There's a lot of overfishing. So it's important to choose the right fishes to eat. There are logos to help you with this, and there are also apps to help you to choose the right fish. But so it's a bit tricky, because the things that we measure in our study do not really take into account the downside of the fish. So that's why we advise not to eat more than once a week fish.
Okay. And what type of fish would be advisable? Maybe
Yeah,
for health and environment?
Yeah, if as Ingeborg correctly said, that's, and connect to the previous question, like what's the environmental impact, right? So the negative environmental impacts from fish are not well captured if you only look at carbon footprint, and that's a problem. And of course, you need to take into account two things when you're talking about fish. One, it is a fatty fish or a non-fatty fish, because the fatty fish have a better combination of nutrients for your body, and also if it is wild caught or if it is farmed fish. Because farmed fish, there's also the problem that you need the fish meal, and you need a lot of energy used into the aquaculture itself. So wild caught fatty fish in a sustainable way, that's your best choice.
Okay, clear. Any other suggestions maybe?
Yeah,
for people to choose?
It's tricky with fish, because we also know that fish is important for health, of course. So choose fish once a week and choose the more fatty fish. And between wild fish and farmed fish, it's difficult for consumers to make the right choices, I think. But I know that the fisheries sector is also looking at these sort of things and working on it a lot. So I hope that in the future it will also be easier for the consumer to make the right choice.
Yes.
So you can still eat fish, but it depends on the choice you make.
Yeah.
Yeah, you definitely should eat fish, just not as any other thing, not too much. And be aware that there are, as with any source, you also have the pros and the cons.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm afraid that we are out of time now.
Yes,
so
there are no more questions, so you can...
it's really good then. Then we are going to finish this session, and we will have a short break, and after the short break, you can go to another session, and we hope to welcome new people in this session, of course. If you want to see this session twice, you can see this session again, of course. But I advise you to take one of the other sessions, and hope to see you afterwards again in the main session. Thank you for your attention.